A low blood oxygen level has been associated with several medical conditions, and with the technology becoming cheaper and smaller, many smartwatch manufacturers like Garmin have added an oxygen saturation sensor to their watches. However, can you rely on these sensors to tell you when something is potentially very wrong? I therefore decided to test the oxygen saturation accuracy of 5 different popular Garmin watches, with the cheapest being the $150 Garmin Vivosmart5 and the most expensive being the $700 Garmin Fenix 7. So let's see if Garmin watches are able to detect a lowered oxygen saturation. Now, as always, I do not want to waste your time, so there are timestamps in the description below and also on the timeline. Hello everyone, for those of you that are new to the channel, my name is Rob and I'm a postdoctoral scientist specializing in biological data analysis. In this video, I'll be testing 5 different Garmin watches: the $150 Garmin Vivosmart5, the $180 Garmin Vivomove Sport, the $350 Garmin Instinct 2, and the equally expensive Garmin Forerunner 255, and the most expensive watch in this test is the $700 Garmin Fenix 7. Now, before getting to the test results, let me briefly introduce what oxygen saturation actually is and why it's important. In really simple terms, this is the percentage of red blood cells in the bloodstream that contain oxygen. Now, this can be important to measure because it can be used as an indication for several medical conditions. For instance, it can be used to 1. Detect sleep apnea, where you basically stop breathing for 30 seconds or more during sleep. 2. Keep track of lung diseases. And 3. Potentially detect respiratory infections such as COVID-19. In all these cases, your blood oxygen saturation can drop to anywhere from the low 90% to 60%. Normal ranges, on the other hand, are generally between 95 and 100%. If your SpO2 gets really low, you could get symptoms like shortness of breath, chest pain, confusion, headache, and rapid heartbeats. Some people might also experience some of these symptoms when climbing up a mountain in a condition known as altitude sickness. Now, there are 2 main ways that you can measure your oxygen saturation yourself. First of all, Garmin watches use what is known as reflectance pulse oximetry, basically shining red and infrared light on your skin and measuring the reflected light. Because red blood cells with oxygen absorb different light colors than red blood cells without oxygen, the ratio of red and infrared light can be used to calculate the percentage of red blood cells that contain oxygen. On the other hand, most dedicated SpO2 monitors use the more established transmittance pulse oximetry, which shines red and infrared light at one side of your finger and measures what comes through on the other side. So it's based on the same principle, but in general, transmittance pulse oximetry is considered more accurate and is used in hospitals around the world. Now, let's take a look at the test and the test results. To see if Garmin watches can detect a low oxygen environment, I went into a special pressurized low oxygen environment. Now, that might sound like a tough place to find, however there's one low oxygen environment many of us will enter several times a year: the cabin of an airplane. In an airplane, the air pressure in the cabin is at about 75% of normal, which is the equivalent of being at 8,000 feet or 2,500 meters, which is the same as about being halfway up Mount Kilimanjaro. This effectively lowers the oxygen concentration in the air of an airplane, which results in you having a lower blood oxygen level while you're flying. Just in case you're wondering, an airplane actually flies at an altitude much higher than 8,000 feet, and the cabin is intentionally pressurized at its equivalent of 8,000 feet. But why is that? Well, if the air pressure inside the airplane would be the same as outside, it would be too dangerous for people. So why don't they just pressurize it to the same air pressure as we have at ground level? Well, that would be too expensive. The bigger the difference between the air pressure inside and outside the plane, the stronger and therefore the heavier the plane must be, which means you would need to use more fuel and you can fly fewer passengers. However, this low air pressure does still have its consequences. It means that the amount of oxygen in the air is about 75% of normal. And for some people, this means that they can experience headaches, some lightheadedness, or nausea while flying. However, luckily, this also means it gives me a great environment to test smartwatches. So let's see how Garmin watches performed at measuring decreased blood oxygen levels. I'll start with the cheapest watch and we'll see if each subsequently more expensive watch performs better. So I tested each of the watches during 2 airplane flights. And here you can see in pink how my oxygen saturation changed over time during the first flight. Now this is based on measurements I took with my reference device, which is this finger pulse oximeter. Before taking off, my blood oxygen levels were normal, so around 97-98%. Then as the plane ascended, my oxygen saturation decreased and it stayed low at about 90-91% during the flight. Then as the plane started to descend, my oxygen saturation levels rose back to normal levels and stayed there. Now let's first look at the results for the cheapest Garmin device I tested, the Garmin Vivosmart5. Now even though this is one of the newest Garmin devices, this still uses an older generation sensor. In green here are the measurements I took during the flight with the Vivosmart5. As you can see, the measurements at least roughly seem to follow the same pattern of SpO2 values as the reference device, with higher measurements as we were taking off, then lower measurements during the flight, and rising and increased measurements again after we descended. And if we compare these results with the measurements I took at normal air pressure that are displayed on the left right here, now these red measurements are the measurements I took in the morning and evening over several days at normal air pressure. And the more often I took a certain measurement, the wider the bar is right here. So the most often it detected an oxygen saturation of 96% at ground level, followed by 97%. We indeed see that the measurements here taken in a low air pressure environment tend to be lower than the ones taken at ground level, so at normal air pressure. Now, as good scientists, we of course want to replicate these results, so I took a second flight, which you can see right here based on the reference device. And again, the measurements of the Vivosmart5 in green generally match up quite okay with the general patterns measured with a dedicated finger pulse oximeter, with lower values during the flight and higher values before that. And again, we see that values in flight tend to be lower than the values measured at ground level. So this is actually not looking too bad, though the match between the reference oximeter and the Vivosmart5 is definitely still far from perfect. So let's now see if the more expensive watches do better. And we'll continue now with the slightly more expensive Garmin Vivomove Sport. This has the same type of sensor as the Vivosmart5. And if we look at the Vivomove Sport's performance during this first flight, this indeed looks similar to what we saw before. The pattern of values more or less nicely matches up with that of the reference device. The values are low during the flight, then increase again as we descended, and once the plane landed, they were more or less back to normal levels. And for the Vivomove Sport, we see an even bigger difference between the measurements taken at ground level, which are again in red on the left, and those measurements taken while flying. So this is actually looking quite good. However, for the second flight, the measurements are a bit more noisy, as you can see in green right here. However, we can still clearly see that the measurements are generally lower during the flight compared to those before taking off and after landing. And again, this difference becomes even more clear if we compare it to all the measurements I took at ground level, again in red here on the left. We indeed see that the measurements in a low pressure environment right here tended to be lower than those measured at ground level. And this is exactly what we would hope to find. Now, so far, we've only looked at the relatively lower end Garmin watches, and these are actually already doing quite well. However, let's now take a look at some of the more expensive, more premium watches, which have the latest generation of sensors. And I want to start off with the Garmin Instinct 2. Unfortunately, I had some charging issues with this watch during the first flight, or in other words, I forgot to plug in my charging station into an outlet the night before the first flight, so I can only share the results from the second flight. And here are the results from the Instinct 2 from that flight. As you can see in green, the values measured by the Instinct 2 did not change much during the flight. It tended to always measure values around 95 and 96%, no matter if the plane cabin was at a lower pressure or not. And the values during the flight in a low pressure environment are not that different from those before and after the flight in a normal pressure environment. And we can see this even more clearly if we add the measurements I took at ground level on the left right here, again in red. As you can see, it also most often measured values of around 95% and 96% at ground level. So the Instinct 2 I have does not seem to be able to pick up on a lowered oxygen saturation, at least not based on this test. So based on this admittedly limited test, it really doesn't seem like the newer sensor of the Garmin Instinct 2 did better than the older generation sensors of the Vivosmart5 and the Vivomove Sport. So let's next take a look at the results for one of the newest Garmin watches I own, the Garmin Forerunner 255, which also costs about $350. Now, I actually tested the Forerunner 255 during 2 different flights than the other watches, and this is the SpO2 profile measured by my reference device for the first flight. Now, even though the measurements appear a bit more noisy in the middle right here, we can still clearly see when the plane took off, when we were in flight, and when we descended again and we're back to normal SpO2 values. If we now plot the measurements of the Forerunner 255 in green in the same plot, it indeed seems that it generally follows along okay with the finger pulse oximeter. It was a bit noisy, but during the flight it does drop to SpO2 values of 94% and lower, as it should. And before taking off and after landing, it tends to measure values of 95% and higher. Now, just to put it into perspective, again here on the left are the values I took with the Forerunner 255 at ground level. If we look at the SpO2 values measured by the Forerunner 255 in flight, we can indeed see that these are generally just a bit lower than the measurements taken at ground level, which we can see on the left right here. However, it does already tend to measure quite low values at ground level, mostly being around 95%, similar to what we saw for some of the other Garmin watches. Now, to make sure that these results were consistent, I took the watch with me on a second flight. Now, during this flight we were delayed though, meaning that after I started recording, we were stuck on the runway for about an hour and a half. And that's why there's this long stretch of relatively normal SpO2 values in the beginning right here. Additionally, something went wrong with the recording of my normal reference device, but luckily I did bring another device based on transmittance pulse oximetry. Specifically, I used the O2 ring from Value that the company sent for me to potentially test. I still have to test how reliable this device is, but based on the patterns it recorded, we can at least see when the plane ascended and when the values went down and when it descended again. The signal is a bit more noisy though, and there is this weird moment right here where during the flight it recorded an increase in SpO2, and I'm not sure if my SpO2 actually increased. If we now plot the values measured by the Forerunner 255 in the same plot, we do see that the patterns are roughly the same for the first part of the flight. Before takeoff, we have relatively high SpO2 values, which decreased as we ascended. However, about halfway through the flight, it kept recording normal SpO2 values, as you can see right here. Though this does at least seem to partially match with what we see based on the other transmittance pulse oximetry reference I was using. So I have no idea what is going on there. And I might actually have had more or less normal SpO2 levels for a while, at least for some reason. During some other flights that I tested the SpO2 ring, it actually showed the exact SpO2 pattern I would expect. So it's not impossible that my SpO2 value actually rose for a while. So while this is looking better for the latest generation of Garmin sensor, at least compared to what we saw for the Instinct 2, I'm actually not sure if this new sensor is performing better compared to what we saw for the cheaper Garmin watches we were looking at before with the older sensor. So to answer that question, let's now take a look at one of Garmin's most premium watches, the Garmin Fenix 7. However, first a quick side note. If you're interested in the latest updates on the wearables I'm testing, I'm planning to start back up with my newsletter and posting more off-the-cuff things on my Instagram and my YouTube Shorts channel. So if you're interested in any of those are linked below. Of course, you would also make me really happy and it would help my efforts if you subscribe to this YouTube channel. But of course, it's totally up to you. Now, enough self-promotion. Let's take a look at the performance of the Fenix 7. And this actually did really well. We can see that here during the first flight. The SpO2 values measured by the Garmin Fenix 7, which are plotted here in green, match up really well with the measurements taken with the reference finger pulse oximeter. And if we plot the measurements taken at ground level to the left of that here in red, we can indeed see that the measurements taken during the flight are much lower than any of the measurements taken at ground level. So this is actually looking really good for the Fenix 7. And if we look at the second flight, we see more or less similar patterns, where the measurements taken with the Fenix 7 in green here more or less line up with the measurements taken with the dedicated finger pulse oximeter. And again, the measurements taken in flight were generally lower than those taken at ground level, which we can again see in red right here. So overall, this is a good sign for the Fenix 7's performance. So out of all the watches I tested, the Fenix 7 seems to potentially do slightly better than the others and definitely better than the Instinct 2. However, to get a better feel for their comparative performance, let's display the results for the watches I tested during the same flight in this same plot. The 3 watches I tested during the first flight are displayed here. And as you can see, the Fenix 7 in red seems to do quite well, following along nicely with the pink reference line. However, the Vivomove Sport in green actually also does quite well, and I would even say that the Vivosmart5 in blue right here is not too bad as well. So all of them are doing quite well. Now during the second flight I tested 4 of the watches, and I would say that overall the results are very similar. The Vivomove Sport in blue and Fenix 7 in red perform best and match best with the reference line in pink. The Vivosmart5 is a bit more noisy but still not too bad, and the Instinct 2 I have is just not doing too well. But this is exactly where the results are confusing for me. As far as I'm aware, the sensors of the Instinct 2 and Fenix 7 are basically the same, but we get quite different results. And it's not just that the Instinct 2 gives poorer results in a low oxygen environment. Also at ground level, the Instinct 2 tends to measure much lower values than the Fenix 7. Basically, the Instinct 2 I have tends to always measure SpO2 values around 95%, no matter if I'm at ground level or in a low oxygen environment. The Fenix 7 on the other hand seems to do a much better job. So why could that be? Well, first of all, it could be that even if they have the same basic sensor, the design or internals of these 2 watches are different enough to cause these measurement differences. Alternatively, maybe some of the materials covering the sensors are different, causing a difference in absorption of the light. Or I might just have gotten a bad unit of the Instinct 2 when it comes to SpO2 measurements. It could also just be that I had bad luck with many of the measurements I took with the Instinct 2. I'm honestly not really sure yet, so if you have any more ideas or comments, let us know in the comments below. However, can we draw any general conclusions from these results? Well, I think so. We can draw several conclusions. First of all, overall, I wasn't disappointed by the performance of most of these Garmin watches I tested. The majority was able to detect when my oxygen saturation dropped. However, I should mention that some of the measurements they took were a bit noisy. Second, the newer generation sensor did not always seem to outperform the older generation sensor, at least based on my testing. So this is something you can keep in the back of your mind when you're deciding which watch to buy. Third, what was a bit concerning is that there was some clear variation in the performance between watches, even between watches with a similar sensor. The question that remains is if this means that there are actual differences between the watches, or even if there's general variation between watches produced, even if we're talking about the exact same model. Now this is something I would still like to test in the future, because if there is big unit-to-unit variation, that would be a bit concerning. Now what we can also say based on these results is that there's no need to panic if a Garmin watch detects a low oxygen saturation. You can first always confirm the low measurement with a dedicated pulse oximeter. However, if in the end you do suspect something is wrong, both based on your symptoms combined with these measurements, you might want to contact a medical professional. And please take my test results with a grain of salt, because a YouTube video from a guy on the internet is just that, just me sharing my own testing, and it's not medical advice. But should you buy a Garmin watch specifically for the oxygen saturation measurements? Well, no, there are much cheaper options out there for that. If you're interested in oxygen saturation, just buy a dedicated finger pulse oximeter. Personally, after trying several different ones from cheap to expensive, I ended up mostly using the relatively cheap one I showed in this video, because it gives me consistent measurements and it's also consistently able to detect a low SpO2 level in a low oxygen environment. I don't think the one I have is for sale anymore, but I think many of the dedicated SpO2 monitors should be able to do a decent job for not too much money. I would therefore mostly see the SpO2 functionality of the Garmin watch as a bonus feature, and an easy way to get an estimate of your SpO2 level on the go. As we saw, most Garmin watches will be able to give a decent indication if your SpO2 level is low, but the main appeal of Garmin watches is in the other features they provide. Garmin watches are generally very solid devices with a nice ecosystem and a good battery life. As I've shown in my other videos, when it comes to health and sports tracking, Garmin generally has robust heart rate tracking, though it's not the best, and is generally very good at GPS tracking. So if you want a reliable watch that will last you quite a while, Garmin has quite a few good options to choose from. However, in terms of health tracking, it does not stand out in any particular category. So if you're interested in anything in particular, for instance, the best heart rate tracker, check out this video I made on that right here. If your focus is on heart rate tracking, I would recommend an Apple Watch for iOS and the Huawei Watch GT3 series or Huawei Watch Fit 2 on Android. Of course, the best heart rate tracker is still an ECG chest strap under most circumstances. If you want good sleep tracking on the other hand, I'd recommend the Whoop strap, a Fitbit, or the Withings Sleep Analyzer, and you can find some of those videos right here. I'll also link the recent reviews I did on Garmin watches right here. Now, I hope this video provided you with some value. Thank you so much for watching and catch you in the next video.